Hi, welcome to this channel on magnetic energy, technology, principles, applications. This video is about magnetic energy and UFOs. It goes without saying that in the magnetic energy world, UFOs are extremely prevalent. So let's just talk real quick about the electromagnetic spectrum, and then we'll compare that to what we can call the magnetic pulse spectrum. And then we'll get into how that relates to UFOs and why they may be difficult to see and communicate with and everything. So the electromagnetic spectrum that our conventional science has identified and mapped out very well, from extremely low frequencies all the way up to gamma rays and etc. That is an interesting analysis of what's happening in the universe. But we've got to, from a magnetic energy model point of view, we have to go a little bit deeper than that to get to how things are actually working. So a magnetic pulse is in this model is defined more as molecular structures that are experiencing a differential in an etheric energy exchange, and it's between an ingoing and outgoing energy, and that creates a magnetic pulse. Now that's different than like an electromagnetic pulse, for example. This is a relatively neutral phenomenon that's occurring. So in this model, the magnetic pulses, or the etheric pulses, if you will, are what create the electromagnetic waves that we are so commonly see, like with equipment around the scientific community. So those waves aren't usually talked about, and their origin isn't usually talked about very much, as far as trying to really get into why they happen, and the idea that in the etheric model that those waves are a disturbance in the ether, and that's what's causing those to happen. So a relatively neutral magnetic pulse does not typically create an electromagnetic wave, a disturbance in the ether, because it's so compatible with the ether. It flies through the etheric field without any disturbance. But as those magnetic pulses become more polarized, if you will, if they take on more of various charges or various polarities, they can then disturb the ether. So a pulse, magnetic pulses can be just any variations in size, shape. They can be the speed, the strength, and they can be the foundation of waves, if you will, electromagnetic waves, throughout the entire spectrum. Sometimes those pulses may be present, like in our dimension, and sometimes they may not be present, and it depends on their polarization, and it depends on what's attracting them and what's being utilized with them. Like, for example, inside the magnetic energy units, you will have a whole variety of magnetic pulses that manifest, and they are measurable. They are doing certain work, and then they immediately are gone, in the sense that they jump either into another dimension, or their work is done. Magnetic pulses function just like everything else in this magnetic universe model. They function on attract. And so they may move at an extraordinary speed, and imagine expanding the electromagnetic spectrum all the way up to a nearly infinite velocity. And then so that would be the magnetic pulse spectrum. That's what it does, because magnetic pulses can move at a nearly infinite velocity. And so then you get into kind of like the quantum entanglement, into the quantum world. And these magnetic pulses, yes, they are often operating in another dimension, which is partly why they are so difficult to monitor and detect with conventional equipment. But the other problem with them is as they originate, or as they they cross the dimensional membrane from a higher dimension to our dimension, they're doing it with a relatively neutral polarity, or even when they become polarized, and they do it with such efficiency that it's difficult to measure them, especially as they maintain a relatively neutral polarity. So our current equipment, for example, like if you look at like dishes like at Arecibo, or things that would try to detect signals from other worlds, the neutral magnetic pulse will go right through that dish, kind of like a neutrino, if you will. But imagine, though, a neutrino that's highly encoded with a variety of magnetic resonance signatures that could be a form of communication. Those are the subatomic components that are being manipulated or changed by, say, another species that's using that energy to communicate. Without the proper materials, like without the proper alloys, you cannot capture that form of communication. You cannot capture those magnetic pulses. So if you had a pin array, like a small pins, and you had each of those hooked up separately, like through sensors into a computer, and you had a pin array of, say, the special kind of alloy, like on our site, like Tialco B, that will capture those relatively neutral magnetic pulses, and then you could translate those. And as soon as scientists start doing that, they will see and hopefully release that information to the public, which they better, but they will see, and people will see, that we are being bombarded by communication that is in that spectrum, that is in that interdimensional spectrum. And that's partly why it's so difficult to detect signals from other worlds, because most of those worlds are slightly more advanced than us, and they're using technology that relies on interdimensional communication and relatively neutral magnetic pulses, and our current equipment just isn't really equipped for that. Now, if you were to try to detect UFOs around the atmosphere or around in orbit, obviously there's top secret government agencies that have this technology, and they'll monitor and track those very carefully. But if you can look for fluctuations in like in the ionosphere, for example, or ionic streams, or things that might look like neutrino streams, that would be an indicator of where those ships are. From a magnetic energy force field point of view, it's very easy to not only absorb, reflect, diffract light, and it's very easy to have your ship not emit any detectable electromagnetic waves, because it's operating at a relatively neutral magnetic pulse frequency, if you will, that is very high, and it doesn't disturb the ether as, like, say, for example, our conventional technology where we produce EMFs or RFs throughout our atmosphere. We have such a great amount of smog. That's an incredible amount of etheric disturbance that we produce. So, but a UFO that's working on magnetic principles won't do that, and so it's very difficult to not only see them visibly, but to see them even through the electromagnetic spectrum, depending on, obviously, the type of technology and the type of ship that they're using. So as magnetic energy comes online, it will become so abundantly clear that there are just an untold number of ships moving at all times throughout our solar system, and obviously beyond. So from an electromagnetic point of view, I think it's important to just touch on this idea that magnetic pulses are the foundation of those waves. So as those magnetic pulses come in and out of our dimension and have manifestation, if they are improperly polarized, or they are a forced extraction of the ether, they will create a disturbance, which then creates a wave. The thing that we're kind of missing from science, from a conventional point of view, is the true power in harnessing energy is not necessarily to capture the byproduct waves, which is what we so commonly, even in relatively new free energy technology, there's a lot of talk about capturing waves. But what's far more powerful and far more interesting than that is to catch the pulses that are creating those waves. And so as you can tap into the pulses, then you can begin to work on an attract principle, and those pulses, magnetic pulses, are readily available through an attract sequence that allows you to then build that energy. Waves are just a byproduct, and so the energy amount in the wave is minimal compared to what's actually contained in the pulse. And the pulse is not difficult to capture if you are using neutral fields and if you are thinking interdimensionally. And so just think like a UFO, think like an alien, and think in terms of pulse rates and a magnetic pulse spectrum and a ship that can fly without disrupting the ether, that doesn't fight against the etheric forces but flows with those forces, and not only that, but uses those forces to propel its vehicle. That's really critical, because in the etheric model there is obviously an abundance of neutral energy, and so that's great for powering a ship. But then there's manifestations of slightly polarized etheric fields and planetary fields and solar system fields that are an expression of that etheric energy, that etheric force, that allow you to grab those polarities and use that as a way to attract your vehicle to its destination. And so it's just, think about, as a UFO is flying through our atmosphere and it's not creating waves. Well, how on earth is it doing that? It's because its field doesn't disturb the etheric field at all. It doesn't produce waves around it, because it's containing everything in a neutral, relatively neutral magnetic bubble. And so, yes, of course, UFOs are real. Of course, the universe is teeming with life. And unlike conventional science wants to put all these insane numbers out there about, oh, well, maybe it's, there might be one intelligent life in, somewhere that it's completely unreachable. All of that is just absolute BS. And everyone in a black ops program or in a top secret government program knows this very clearly, that the universe is teeming with life and it's all around us. It's just that we're not detecting what the signals are that they're producing, because they're just not really in the electromagnetic spectrum. They're more in the magnetic pulse spectrum. And so with that said, we'll see you next time.